All right, well, thank you everyone again for joining. I'm very happy to introduce Scott Renshaw to us. So Scott, uh, he is a mathematical and computational sociologist specializing in social network analysis with research interests in communication dynamics, belief formation, and hazards and disasters. He is currently a postdoctoral research associate at the Center for Informed Democracy and Social Cybersecurity, also known as IDEA. And he works closely with Professor Kathleen Carley, who I think we all know well through the working group. So Scott, welcome. We're so glad that you're here, especially being on the West Coast. I know it's much earlier there. So thank you so much for that. And I will turn it over to you now.
All right. Thank you so much. Oh, it's great to be part of this. Despite being early, it's good to get together and present ongoing research. So let me share my screen. Can we all see that? All righty. So hi, my name is Scott Renshaw, as the intro just gave. Chris just let you guys know. I'm a postdoctoral research associate under Kathleen Carley. So today I'm going to be presenting work from my dissertation, and I'm going to try to put a different spin on it in thinking about kind of the next steps of looking at communication at different levels from the micro to macro kind of analyses. And I do cover a couple of those in terms of generally what are lower level kind of dynamic process person to person versus larger level like analyses of entire mediums of communication by organizations, say. Okay, so just an overview. I'm going to start with an introduction, kind of setting the scene of what the studies are talking about, and looking at the micro to macro kind of idea. And then I'm going to hop into the three studies that I did in part of my dissertation. So the first is on the National Weather Service and their communication on Twitter from 2009 to 2022. I also have a study on COVID-19 communication during the first 8 months of the COVID-19 pandemic on Twitter. And then the last study is really the micro study, looking at the radio communication dynamics between individuals inside and outside of the World Trade Center during the 9/11 terrorist attack. So to start off, I want to get this idea of hazard, frequency, and familiarity. We have events that are very quotidian. I'm in Portland, Oregon right now, so rain is very quotidian kinds of hazards experienced by Portlandians. There are more atypical hazards that are experienced, and it also ranges from where you're living in the United States or in the world, what kinds of hazards are kind of considered quotidian versus atypical. But I just want to get thinking in the frame of more common and more exotic. So if we then kind of think about what are these exotic kinds of hazards and disasters, we can think of things like global pandemics. You have issues of volcanic eruptions, and also the 9/11 is would be an example of a very more exotic. These terrorist attacks are rare. So my dissertation, the framing of the dissertation between these three studies looks at the quotidian to the exotic on this continuum. And so on the left-hand side, you have the quotidian. These are things that are like the common cold, rain. In the middle, you have more atypical events like hurricanes and tornadoes. And on the end, you have the exotic events. And so in terms of framing my studies, the first study is the National Weather Service, and throughout their entire communication medium for all their accounts. And so what you end up having are communications in the quotidian. So there's either there's nothing happening, or it's kind of like, describing the weather, towards more atypical events. The second study is the COVID-19 study. So that happens during a time where this pandemic is an exotic thing. We don't understand how it's going to affect people. But then after a while, within the first couple months, it starts to become the new normal. That was a phrase that was kind of repeated a lot. So it kind of sits between the atypical and the exotic. And the final study is squarely in the exotic regime in reference to the 9/11 disaster. So the first study is a study of social amplification of communications by the National Weather Service on the OSN Twitter from 2009 to 2021. The second study is also similar. It's looking at social amplification of public health communications, also in emergency management and governmental officials during the first 8 months of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the third study is an investigation of 17 radio communication networks during the unfolding World Trade Center disaster, and with paying particular with a particular focus on hub formation process. So this idea of coordination. So then again, the thing that I'm kind of, now that I'm, I'm moving, this is my just finishing my first year of postdoc research, kind of getting those papers into a full swing. I really want to think of my prior research and how to frame it in a way, how to frame, all of my research in a way. And I think one of the things that I'm currently thinking about is this idea of macro and micro kind of space for the communication. So like if we're analyzing the one-to-one radio communications, that's going to be that's going to be more of the micro. It's the person-to-person dynamic process. On the other end, you have macro. This is like an analysis of an entire communication medium for an organization, or just an aggregate kind of analysis, where the second study kind of fits in this middle part, where it's looking at communications by particular accounts within a particular time period. So it's more case study oriented. So it kind of fits in that area. And so I just that's the thinking of kind of my future research and kind of framing generally the things that I'm interested in. So I'll start with the first study. It's Writers of the Storm, an examination of the National Weather Service communications from 2009, 2021. And this is work done with Jeanette Sutton and Carter T. Butts when I was at UCI. So the National Weather Service provides critical information on weather hazards such as tornadoes, hurricanes, and blizzards. And historically, this information was broadcast through means of public address systems. These are radio, television, and sirens. By 2009, the National Weather Service started using the online social network Twitter in an experimental manner. With only certain accounts adopting it. It wasn't rolled out for the full organization. But by 2013, it became a key part of their hazard communication and warning infrastructure. They call it at that point supplemental. This is a supplemental information source. And so now at this point, all National Weather Service regional and national offices have their own Twitter accounts. And so we want to think about what information transmission was in the past in a traditional media sense. You would have a broadcast on television. There would be people attending to the message here. And then someone could decide, I'm going to go and tell the other people that were in the other room what they missed on the television. Or you may see someone actually call someone up and say, hey, there's some event happening. But one thing that kind of limits this medium and compared to online social media is the bidirectional dialogue that can happen on social media. So message retransmission overall on Twitter it comes in the form of retweeting, and it provides a context which users can get the word out and send the message to their extended social networks. And so this is, if for those who aren't, probably none of you, all of you are probably very aware of Twitter, but the retweet button is at the bottom and it's a count. So now we can look at the information transmission process on Twitter, and we see that there's this process by which you can have a dialogue between the office that's putting the message out. The followers then can retweet the message to their extended networks. And what's kind of nice about this is where you have, in a traditional sense, the telephone game of what kind of information is lost across spreading to telling different people what they heard. Here you have information that in a retweet has full fidelity. That you can add stuff onto it, but it has an original context that you can click on and look into the details of. And so in the prior research, going back to the 40s, It was been found in the rumoring context that salient information that clears up ambiguity is most likely to be passed on. There were some studies in the 60s and 70s that looked at message tracing and chains of message passing. The Greenberg study in particular looked at where people were during and who they heard about the JFK assassination. So that's a fascinating study. There's been a long history of studying this in the context of hazards and disasters. And an early finding that I think rings true for what I've been doing is that people under threat look towards these official organizations to lessen ambiguity. We look to authority to figure out, and in this case, the National Weather Service is that authority on weather hazards. And we can think of what's nice about Twitter, it allows for a fine-grained vantage point of information passing in regards to content structure and style. And each tweet has what we call in our literature a microstructure. There are features and building blocks that you can add, or you can add to your message, including images, mentions, and that. So just to get an idea of what those microstructure features are, you have things like URLs, hashtags, mentions, etc. So factors found by Sutton et al. In 2015 was that the number of followers increases retransmission, as does the use of agreed upon hashtags. And then messages that are directed at individuals or include URLs are less widely disseminated than message without those microstructural features. We've also found that for message content, messages that contain directive and instructional sentence styles increase retransmission, while the marketing literature has also found that community building can increase. So doing things in a sense, a pre-hazard quotidian period can build the community for a future when you need to get a message out for a hazard. So getting to the data and methods. The data was collected by the Heroic Group at UCI, and it was collected through the academic Twitter API, and it's a census. So it's all of the communications by each National Weather Service account, national, local, and regional from 2009, 2021. It's almost around 3 million public communications. Because the data is skewed count, most tweets don't get retweeted. We're going to be using the negative binomial regression, and it accounts for unobserved heterogeneity in the transmission process, while it manifests, which manifests as an overdispersion relative to a Poisson process. It allows us to model the message retransmission looking at these microstructural and content features. So hopping into the results. So as I said in the previous intro, the National Weather Service adopted and started using Twitter in 2009, and around 2013 it became part of their repertoire, part of their supplementary information infrastructure. So what we're seeing here with 2013 held out as the comparison, the comparison group, we see that in the pre-experimental period that their retransmission was low on average. If you look after 2014 onward, you have this really nice, kind of coherence or coalescence around this one retransmission. And we're not 100% sure what's going on here. It probably has something to do with standardization, but this is kind of the future research we want to look into. What is going on where you have this really, obvious pattern of before this period, there was low retransmission. And then after it's this, really clean across the board, kind of standardized effect. So for message structural features, the largest, as you can see over here, are the replies, URLs, and mentions. Replies, in a lot of ways, is a one-to-one communication process. And people don't want to retweet that because they're not included on that. It's not seen as kind of for everybody. And so that really diminishes its ability to get out. So if we remove that one just to kind of look at the effects for what's left, again, we see the follower count. It's really matters. I mean, that's a good sanity check that things are working the way we think they work. The use of media is really important, as is the use of exclamation marks. So this is in the context of like hazards. You want to really put a point to like when things need to be kind of paid attention to. And URLs have this negative effect, which has been found in the literature, and we hypothesize is because it brings people off of the medium. It takes you away from Twitter when you click on a link, whereas there's a kind of a wanting people seeming to want to stay on the medium and see more information that they're on that medium, on that platform for. So some other effects we have in this model, we have the things that relate to the amount of caps. So writing in all capitalization for the messages. So messages that have more than 75% capitalization are really highly transmissible. And so this, along with the exclamation mark, has to do with if something's really important and you want to say it in a very exclamatory way, it will help in the context of hazard communication. There's also the research on the hashtag of named storms and names using the named storms. So if you have a hurricane that has a name, using that name often gets an increase in retransmission because it's on topic, it's salient to individuals. And then on the other end, we have things that really decrease retransmission. And one of them I like to point out is the National Weather Service bot. And this is previous to the recent API shutdown. I don't know what they're doing currently, but the National Weather Service had a bot that would take warnings and watch information and transmit that on Twitter in a way that looked like it was not human generated. It's very structured. It's the kind of the watch warning information you see on the ticker on your TV. And so this is negative. And what's interesting in that regard, we're thinking there's something about human written content on social media being more retransmissible. So there's some really interesting kinds of effects here. And so generally some of the findings, future directions, we find that the influences of message retransmission on Twitter are very similar to the prior mechanisms posited in the early rumoring literature by Allport and Postman and Shibutani. Information is passed on that is salient to the individual and provides clarity in times of ambiguity. Audience narrowing, we have mentioning. It really drastically decreases the potential for retransmission, and it makes the message less salient to the rest of the audience. So some things that I'm kind of interested in going forward, really what's happening with the communication post 2013. Is it standardization? What's going on there? There's also, I'd like to do something where you can identify emerging strategies for communication during those hazard events. You might find that over time, they're trying different combinations of things like using hashtags and images. And does that kind of, for an organization, does it get to a point where then you have like standard operating procedure, you kind of fall in a range of operating, where earlier periods, and this might explain the retransmission rates early on, is that they were kind of figuring out what the medium was used for and how to get the most out of it. And I'd like to also investigate the intra-organizational communication strategies. You want to think that there are people in the organization, like the main National Weather Service account, that have much larger follower base. And so if you have regional or local accounts that are trying to get a message out, say like a blood drive, for instance, and they want people, because there's a hazard happening in some local area, they want more people in other places to go donate blood, they might leverage the other accounts with larger followers. And I think that would be a really interesting future direction. So the second paper is cutting through the noise, and these are predictors. It's about predictors of successful online retransmission during the first 8 months of the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is also work with Jeanette Sutton and Carter Butts, and also a grad student at UCI, Sabrina Mine. And this really similar to the last study, but in the context of of COVID-19 with a particular emphasis on image content. So as we all know and experience, the SARS-CoV-2 was the severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus disease 2, first identified in Wuhan, China, December 2019. And it spreads mainly through close proximity of infected individuals, mainly by small droplets and aerosols. Due to its transmission mechanism, many of the interventions have had social behavioral components. This includes social distancing, masking, and stay-at-home orders. So these require people to heed information and then change their behavior in reference. And therefore, kind of public health communication becomes really critical. The downside is you get over the general population can get information overload because it's just a lot, and it can change very quick, and we saw that happen. And so there was a term that was coined called infodemics during this time. And this is where there's like a swirling of information, what's true, what's not. It's information overload, and there's competing information within the space. And it typically refers to the rapid and far dissemination of information, usually inaccurate or misleading about something such as a disease. The term infodemic was actually first used in 2003 during the original SARS outbreak. It regained usage during COVID-19 by the UN and the WHO as early as March 2020. And now that WHO holds an annual conference on infodemics, which is pretty fascinating. So one of the things that I really wanted this study to get at was, if we're in the previous studies with the National Weather Service, we're helping them, kind of what are some strategies they can use that will help them get their message out further during a hazard event. And so this comes through this idea of, if there's all this if there's an infodemic occurring, there's mis and disinformation swirling around, how do you cut through the noise to get your message out? And so one of the things that we noticed that were used and leveraged a lot by the public health community are these infographics. So prior work has found that including an image is an effective means to get message passed, but no research has really been done within the space of retransmission and message passing to investigate whether the content of the image has a impact. And so the question then remains, do people just share an image just to share an image? Do people share just like cat images because they're cute? And so this kind of calls back to some old communication literature and theory, this hot and cool media, where cool media requires a more participation from the audience, television conversations, seminars, it's more thoughtful, cool. Whereas hot media is reactive, it revokes reactions, images, movies, radio. So it would be interesting to know on Twitter within the context of COVID-19, is it a cool medium? Is it a hot medium? What are the images that are being passed on? And so the question is, are the images, are there just memes that are being shared, or is it another fluff off topic stuff, or are they thoughtfully engaging? So to data and methods, this data was collected at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic using the Twitter REST API. From January 1st to August 31st is the data that we're looking at today. It has around 372,000 unique messages with around 250,000 unique images. And we have tweets that contain more than one image, because at the time you could have up to 4 images within one tweet. We generated a list of 700 Twitter accounts, and then looked at within the period. They were public health communicators, state and local emergency management officials, governors, and mayors of the top 100 populated cities in the United States. And these are US-based communicators. We use optical character recognition through the ImageMagick and Tesseract OCR engine and R. And we then had a lexicon that was able to get at certain phrases of efficacy and primary threat. And we use that to then code out the images, the text in the images. Again, we're using the negative binomial regression, and this is because 75% have of the tweets have less than 8 retweets, and 50 have less than 2. So it's really skewed. Most tweets do not get retweeted. So some results. I'm just going to focus on the image results today because in reference to time, as well as a lot of the same kind of features, follower count increases retransmission, images generally increase retransmission. So I'm just going to focus on when you code the content of the image, what are the effects? And so you see the first few content that has surveillance information, susceptibility information, where is the disease, who can get the disease, how do I make sure I can, protect myself from the disease? And how are we going to stay, resilient and protect ourselves in an enduring way? Also the symptoms. These are all things that really increase retransmission for these tweets with images. Now, what's interesting is these can be paired together. So if your message has information on surveillance, susceptibility, and efficacy, it increases the retransmission in an additive way. There's also information on openings and closings, primary threat, and these are also things that help in retransmission. On the other end, we have the effects that are negative. So at this point, it seemed like there's a weak association between things that are like collective efficacy, we can do it all together if we try kinds of messages. During the first 8 months, it seems like what people are really interacting with and matter to people in terms of retransmission are messages of how does this affect me, saliency, and how does it get rid of ambiguity, like surveillance, where is it? The other interesting thing is we have an effect for whether the image has text, and it's not significant. And this is saying that having any text on an image doesn't really matter. So controlling for any other text, it's about what kind of text. So the content of the text really does matter of these images. And also the number of images per tweet, and this can be additive up to 4. If you put more images, it really doesn't help. That's what that says. Let's see. So generally, the findings are, some of the most shared and most retweeted messages were literally like Xeroxed official documents by state and local governors, which was really kind of surprising when you think of Twitter as this kind of place where people are sharing memes, and it's really, it doesn't seem to be as serious, but in this context, the people were sharing information that was serious and was relevant. And so it seems like in this context that the users on average are interacting with the media thoughtfully. They're sharing things that they think that other people might want to use or need to know. And this is also going in line with the rumor transmission literature, individual saliency, and clears up ambiguity. And in our paper, we have recommendations for practice. And this, I'm not going to go over each one, but I do like having this where you can tell the practitioner kind of a bullet point, how can you use my research? And I really try to do this in a lot of my studies. And if anyone wants to look into this more, I can send that to them after the talk. The final one, and also, how am I doing for time? Chris.
Oh, sorry, struggling to find my unmute button. You're good. We've got it's 11:40 right now, so I think you've got probably another 7 to 10 minutes.
Okay, great. So I can get through this one quick. All right. So the last study is more of the micro level. So the last two are at the more macro, looking at communication across many years, and then you have more meso, where it's looking at within a very short time period. For a very select number of accounts, what's kind of happening. This study is more at the micro level of the interpersonal kind of dynamic process. So this is modeling complex interactions in a disrupted environment, relational events in the World Trade Center response. So I'm going to start with an introduction and background. I'm going to get into the disaster event, what we know about it, what prior literature has been, research has been done in the communication dynamics content area. We're going to go into methods and data. And then there's two sets of results. The first is we first need models to actually look at this dynamic process. And once we have those models, we can then simulate, generate networks from that model and do knockout simulations to see what kinds of those effects are leading to those the structure that we're seeing ultimately in which of these hub structures. And then I'll go into discussion in future directions. And so I'd like to start with a quote by Tierney. It's disaster is this kind of this period or this time where many people are trying to do quickly what they do not ordinarily do in an environment with which they are not familiar. And so there's this common disaster myth where when people are faced with sudden threat, that individuals are going to, if they don't have specific preparation for that event or that threat, they'll either wait passively for someone to rescue them, or they'll fly into a state of an uncontrolled panic. And there's a lot of literature that has shown that this is not true. That individuals in harm's way are way more likely to immediately assess that threat and then determine appropriate response measures and take initiative to carry them out. And this really comes down to the coordination between individuals, coordination between actors. A central aspect of coordination is communication. In some of the early studies, especially Bavelis and Barrett, they find that certain structures can actually inhibit or facilitate group performance on a task. So in the context of communication, this is obviously important. And while emergence of coordination response to threat has been established, exact mechanisms in the context of a threat or hazard has not really been studied thoroughly. And this is because we've lacked detailed data on communication dynamics in a disrupted setting. It's hard to get that data unless you're prospectively collecting it in some sort of way. And there's been a lack of a principled modeling strategy for inferring those driving mechanisms. So the part of the paper is talking about disentangling this myth. And there's this issue of there's variation in the extent to prior planning, rehearsal of plans, and prior experience with similar disasters. And that does in part decide whether the organizational response is successful or not. And so specialized individuals are those who have had these emergency preparedness training. So this is like police, fire, and rescue. And part of this is they have what's called standard operating procedure. And this can be within the context of an event, who do I contact next? But there's also the issue of standard operating procedure on radio, where there are rehearsed plans and routines and ways that people respond on radio, kind of like conversational norms for radio. Much emergency phase response activity is improvised, but not necessarily disorganized or ineffective. So then you have individuals who are non-specialized. They have no particular training, like maintenance staff, but they have to, in a sense, respond to the threat that's impacting them at the moment. So in the case of the World Trade Center, the prior work has found that the aggregate networks, the communication networks, are held together by a relatively small number of highly central actors. People occupying an institutionalized coordinator role, ICR, these are individuals who have been a manager, have had some preparedness training. And having ICR status makes them more likely to be at the center of these hub structures. But a lot of the majority of the coordinators, people in those positions, were found to be emergent, not necessarily related to ICR status. So we've identified that there's emergent coordination, there's a formation of hub structures, and all these prior studies were cross-sectional. So they weren't really able to dig into the dynamics of the unfolding phenomenon. So just to give you an idea of what these networks look like, there's non-specialists on the right and specialists on the left, because there's specialist kinds of networks, and then there's specialized individuals also. And these are fixed radio signal communications for 17 different contexts. And you can see that there are hub structures. There are individuals who are at the center of these hubs. So we're hypothesizing some hub form mechanisms for this paper. The first is institutionalized coordinator role. If I'm an institutionalized coordinator, I'm likely to be talked to. Preferential attachment. If I start talking, people start to talk to me, and then they kind of, it's like a snowball effect. And conversational inertia. This is like the process of different conversational norms, like I talk to you, you talk back. I talk to you, someone interrupts me and talks to you. And that kind of dynamic process leads to the hub structure that we're interested in potentially. So for methods and data, just to give you an overview of how the data was collected, they're from transcripts after the first airplane crashed into the North Tower at 8:46. The transcripts range from 1 hour and 15 minutes, which was inside the World Trade Center, to 3 hours and 33 minutes, and includes police and fire units, airport terminals, maintenance staff, and security personnel. So because we've had recent progress with the relational event model paradigm, especially for this paper is the first general use REM simulator, it's greatly lowered the barrier to the methodological issue, and it makes us able to investigate the microdynamic processes. The modeling framework allows for looking at the overall communication dynamics and not just cross-sectional slices. So we have these different effects. I'm not going to get into the weeds with this, but there's preferential attachment, which is like saliency, institutionalized coordinator role, these managers or dispatchers, and then conversational inertia, and that's been kind of operationalized as these turn-taking mechanisms. So the first with the relational event models, we did a forward and backward selection for all of these terms for all 17 networks, and then found the best fitting model by AIC. We ended up, so this is just to show you if the term was in the model for so the row is the network, and the columns are the terms that are the effects. If it has it, it's positive or negative, depending on which direction is the value. But I think it's easier to see in the context of a plot. You have the posterior modes for the event model parameters with the asymptotic 95% posterior intervals. And so you see overall the biggest and the largest effects are the PA. So these are preferential attachment, but they range. So there looks like there's a difference between the bolded, which are the specialized, and the non-specialist network. So there are some differences between the two groups, but overall, surprisingly, the specialist and non-specialist networks seem to behave very similarly within the context of these networks. And over here we see always positive are these participation shifts, which are the conversational inertia terms. And then again, ICR has some effect in some of the networks, but in some networks is non-significant. So taking that, we're able to then do something which I think is the more important kind of contribution. It allows us to test situations where we systematically knock out those parameters. So if we want to see how does this network function if we disallow certain participation shifts, or if we knock out preferential attachment. So the intuition here is we can think of this as testing different scenarios. What would the social world look like if preferential attachment didn't matter to this group, if there weren't well-established conversational norms? And so we had to get at some idea of what is hub structure loss. And so the Thiel index is a special case of generalized entropy index, and it's the entropic cost of going from an equal distribution to that of the observed system. And you can think of it as expressing the extent to which social mechanisms are systematically organizing or biasing activity versus just letting it happen at random. And we calculate it for all of the networks, and then we look at the replicate simulations for the 4 knockout groups. So to visualize that in general, on down here, we have all of the networks. So I'm going to zoom in. We can see that we have the green is preferential attachment. Sorry, the green is preferential attachment. Oh my God. It got excited. Hold on.
Oh, no, you're fine. There you go. I see it back now, the PowerPoint.
Yeah. Sorry about that. So what we see is green is preferential attachment. The orangey color is the conversational inertia, and the red is ICR status. So there are on the left, we have networks where so the baseline is the one is the baseline for the non-removed content. And then when you remove them, how does it affect the field index, which is the hubbiness of the hub structure of the network? So when you remove ICR for these networks on the left, you see these really big decreases in the hub structure when you remove the ICR. On the other end, you see that in participation, preferential attachment, when you remove it for some networks, that has a really big impact. But across the board, the largest impact to communicate, the formation of hub structure are these conversational norms of if I talk to you, you talk back. And so that was kind of a really interesting finding, given that we would expect we were kind of interested in what would be the common thing between the two networks, the two groups that would decrease the coordination structure, the hub structure. And it's literally just the process by which individuals talk back and forth to each other. So for discussion in future directions, the most significant factor for hub formation by and large are conversational inertia and conversational norms, turn taking, which is kind of surprising. It's a really micro feature for the network, and it's not some like manifest like, oh, I'm or, you know, it's emergent. It's not, I'm an ICR, I have this status, therefore I'm going to be at the center of these all the time. And so despite the chaotic environment, people are using these radio SOP norms. Preferential attachment in these ICR roles do hold a role in the formation of hub structure, but not at the same magnitude as conversational norms or across the board. And generally, we're seeing that the specialized and non-specialized networks look really similar. And that's also really interesting because we might expect a priori that with the specialized individuals with their training would be able to respond in a way that you know, was different from the regular folks. So future research for this, we love to test hub formation mechanisms in other disaster and hazard contexts. There's been some research that's looked at it within Air France 447 incident, which has also found increases in these turn-taking dynamics. So it might just be in these kind of stressful contexts, we really do go back to these simple, I talk, you talk, I respond, very, you know, almost robotic kind of process, you know, very structured. We would also love to test in contexts that are less restricted to a single channel of communication or other chat contexts. So National Weather Service has a chat. There's also multi-channel communication mediums like Discord, and then investigating them in other non-hazard contexts like Telegram. I'd love to do some research where you're looking at these processes in other contexts. And the knockout studies are kind of interesting because you could be like, oh, if I'm a moderator or admin, or, you know, I own a company and I'm trying to get rid of disinformation, if I remove people who are, you know, bad actors, how does that affect the network in the unfolding dynamics sense? So just to go back to the general idea, we had the micro and macro, and this is where the kind of the studies I overviewed. And I'd really like to call for a unifying theory, particularly within hazard communication, but broadly in how we should be thinking. We should both consider familiarity of hazards, but also the scale of the social interaction. And I don't think that's just a hazard thing. I think when we're thinking about the content of in the context of our case in reference to a larger phenomenon, there's the aggregate, and then there's also the kind of the micro person-to-person interaction that forms the aggregate, right? And so I like to conduct both macro and micro analyses on the same data set, so you can get this idea of like zooming in and zooming out, and how does that change our results and change the way we think about these things. But that requires us to collect data in a way that allows for those kind of studies to be done. So it's a call for you when you're collecting data, you know, to be thinking about these kind of differences. And if I aggregate, if I don't collect at a, you know, in a time ordered manner or something like that, just to consider. So with that, thank you so much. I hope I didn't totally go over time. I might have, but I appreciate you sticking with me through it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Scott. That was really fascinating, just series of topics there. I'd like to open it up to everyone here on the call. Do you have any questions for Scott? Anything pique your interest or something you'd like to hear more about related to the study?
Hey Scott, this is David Stafford. I don't have any direct questions right now.
Sure.
I was going to send you a follow-up email because the 9/11 portion is pretty interesting to me. Are you still at the Carnegie Mellon
Yep.
email? Okay, great.
Yep. Yeah, that study is you know, my grad school advisor says it's really you know, one morning in September has really sparked a lot of research that, you know, and really helping us understand dynamics during an event. You know, we're currently working on a paper. It's the same data set. We're looking at the radio communication, and we're kind of taking it the next step by saying, you know, you have these disaster events, and we want to know when people die and people become incapacitated on the radio front, how does that impact the conversational dynamics? So there's this history in the networks literature for node removal studies, edge removal studies. And so usually the context of those studies are, we have an aggregate network, and then we cut out certain actors, and then we see how the network fragments. You know, how does information not get passed as easily, as less efficient? This study is I think from reading the literature, is one of the first to really get at, you have a dynamic unfolding communication process because you're simulating it, and you simulate it from the network, the data that we have. And then you run it to a certain point, and you kill people or you incapacitate people. You basically suppress their ability to respond. So the people in the network, they'll start talking to them because they already have it's an event history dynamic model. So if they have a previous conversation going on, they have a tendency towards contacting them, despite the fact that they can't respond and they don't know that they're incapacitated. So it really simulates this idea of, during a disaster, what could possibly happen. And so some of the preliminary results with that, which I'm really excited about, it looks a lot like social insect studies. Social insect studies find that like upwards of 50% of a colony is loafing, or is not performing a task, is either lazing about and not performing something. But when you remove ants, and they've done this experimentally, they find that those reserves, what they thought might be reserves, they didn't actually have a way of finding that to be true. They tested it, they removed them, they find that they activate, and they keep the same level of productivity. So in this study, what we're doing is removing people, and then we find that the rest of the network kind of comes rises to the occasion, which is then not a study of robustness, which is usually the typical network edge removal study, but a study of resilience. So I'm really excited about that work, and that should be finished soon. It's in a colleague's dissertation. So,
Oh, great, cool.
Yeah.
Any other questions? I know we're getting close to the top of the hour, but we've got time maybe for one more question. You want to ask one?
Well, you're all welcome to follow up with me over email. I'm also doing some work on belief formation and conspiracy theories. So that's some cool stuff. Hopefully in the fall, I can come back and present that to y'all.
That'd be awesome. Well, thank you so much, Scott, for your time. And thank you all again for joining. I apologize again, as I'm no Nitin, but you should be back next month for our next working group meeting. So thank you all. Thank you again so much, Scott, for your time. And I wish you all a wonderful rest of your week.